Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Foote from the Gardner Institute. I'm so pleased today to have this opportunity to share a little bit with you about this topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and it's beyond belonging, creating spaces for first-generation transfer students to flourish. I'd like to begin by thanking all of you for making time and space in your day for this presentation. Here are some outcomes that I have for our very brief session today. I do want to let you all know that you have a copy of the slides as well as all of the resources and references to which I will refer in this presentation. Obviously, with such a small window of time, I don't have enough time to do any of those references or resources adequate justice, so I do hope that you will explore them further in the resources that I've shared with you. I also hope that at the end of the session, at least, maybe we'll have some ideas about the ways in which we can begin to reframe our own thinking about first generation transfer students and think about how we can adapt and apply some different pedagogical practices in our own courses and or in our practice with transfer students. Here's some highlights for our journey today. Obviously, because this is a recorded on-demand session, we don't have an opportunity to do a live Q&A, but at the end of the presentation, I provided my contact information, and I would hope that you all would be interested in perhaps engaging with each other and having some opportunity for dialogue around this topic. I also have provided in the resources for today a Padlet, so you can share reflections, thoughts, questions, and reactions to this session, as well as anything else that's at the forefront of your mind relative to first generation transfer students in that space. So we'll start with a quick rundown of some of what we know from the research and practice literature about first generation students and their identities. I'll talk very quickly about some pedagogies and practices that respond specifically to these students and to their identities. And then we'll have some pause for opportunity to reflect and commit, put in parentheses discussion, because obviously we won't be able to discuss our own reflections and commitment to making some changes in real time. But again, we can use the Padlet, and you all can reach out to me if you'd like to share any of those reflections. And then lastly, that Q&A. So very quickly, we want to get into some of the characteristics and identities of first generation students. And I'm not going to spend as much time talking about characteristics of transfer students because I'm assuming that you all are probably thinking already about who your transfer students are. Maybe you're even more intimately aware of who those students are, but perhaps you haven't yet explored first generation transfer students. So what I will be sharing next will really focus on more broadly on first generation students and understanding first generation. And then we can pair that with what we know from the research and practice literature about transfer students. So I would encourage you first to think about what it is that you know about your first generation students at your institution and from what sources do you derive this information. From a historical perspective, we often think from deficit lens about first generation students. We think about things like academic underpreparedness or lacking familial or social support. We think about them as at risk. We think about them also as being vulnerable. But I hope that through this session, we'll begin to see that these are students who are resilient and that they are, like all of us, operating within unjust systems and structures, including the unwritten curriculum. So when we think about first generation students, especially first generation transfer students who have sort of that double negative often, I hope that through this session and through the other sessions at the conference, we'll begin to think from an assets-based perspective about these students and what they bring to our courses and to our programs and services. So this quote that's on the screen, we set up first generation college students to be heroes, and that's a lot of pressure. The reality of it is wealthy students aren't expected to lift their whole families out of economic insecurity. This quote appeared in an article about the work at Paul Quinn College. Paul Quinn College, and this was featured in Inside Higher Ed in the fall, and I've got a link to it in the resources I've shared. Paul Quinn College surprised more than 400 high school seniors who were visiting the campus with offers of admission for them and family members. So the deal was the students who turned up for the on-site campus visit were also invited to bring two family members. So two family members were admitted to the college. And they also provided financial support to these students. They were all Pell eligible. So there's a strong commitment. And I think that this quote, though, is really important, not just because of what's happening at Paul Quinn College, but because we have to understand when we talk about first generation students and first generation transfer students, that these are students who feel a significant amount of responsibility to themselves, to their families, and to their communities. And often they place these, feelings on themselves, but they also feel the pressure too, sometimes from families and communities, because they're the chosen ones. And I think the pressure is even greater for transfer students because they may see the stakes are higher. They may feel that they have less time because they've come from another institution. They may have other complicating factors that make it more challenging for them to prioritize education in this moment. So I think that it's important because we have to acknowledge that these are students who often feel responsible for lifting their families out of poverty, and that weighs very heavily on them and on the decisions that they make. But there are so many now efforts, like Paul Quinn College has extended to, create some social upward mobility. And as we think about what we can do to support our first generation transfer students, I hope that's where more of us will go as we think through the innovative practices that we might be able to use in our approaches. This infographic that you'll see on the screen, the levels of first generation, has also appeared in an article, a separate article in Inside Higher Ed in the fall. And I love this because first generation is very complex. It's difficult sometimes to settle on one definition of first generation. Some of the national programs that are aimed at first generation college students operate within one definition. And in our own institutions, we may have multiple definitions of first generationness. So what I love about this is that we're able to sort of parse out the different types of first generationness and understand that there are complexities and intersectionality that occurs within, all of these and within the other identities that our students are negotiating. So when we think about first generation students, sometimes we think about those whose parents or immediate family members have not attended college. And we know that based on the national data, that these are students that comprise over a third of college goers nationwide and more than 20% of the 7 million undergraduate students at four-year institutions. But we also know, again, that there are different levels and different nuances that exist within first generation identities. On the left-hand side, there's level 1, parents or guardians have attended some college but did not complete. Level 2, siblings have attended or completed college, but parents did not attend. Level 3, extended family members. That could include grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins have attended or completed college, but parents and siblings have not. And then level 4, no one in the immediate or extended family have attended or completed college. So I think it's important for us to think through these different levels, and again, the nuances that exist within the identities of our first generation students, and then added on to that are the differences in transfer student identities, and again, the intersectionality that exists between all of them. Also, from a theoretical perspective, it's helpful to look to some of the research and literature out there, again, around first generation students, and to help us reframe our thinking about first generation transfer students and to take a more assets-based approach. I share with you Yasso's community cultural wealth model. And I think there's not enough time, obviously, in this presentation to talk through the different components of this, but I've linked to the original paper that Yasso wrote and published in 2005, which I think is a pretty accessible paper. And I think that it was an important paper, and the model is important because it again helps us to reframe our thinking about first generation students. And I found this to be incredibly useful in my own work with first generation transfer students, because it helps to account for some of the different forms of capital, some of which may be present and some may not be present. They may be areas that we can work on through the programs and services that we can offer to these students. So what you'll see on the screen and in the paper is that there are multiple forms of capital: aspirational capital, linguistic capital, familial capital, social capital, navigational capital, and resistant capital. And in some form or fashion, these exist, within the lives and identities of our students. But what we can do here is to use the Osgood model to identify ways in which we might celebrate these different forms of capital and use these forms of capital to help leverage and to increase other aspects of capital. So specifically, I like to think about, how is it that we can use identity, aspects of identity, maybe social capital from our own cultural sort of communities, our social upbringing, to create forms of navigational capital, or how can we use familial capital? How can we use our linguistic capital within the constructs of our classrooms? So I think that it's very important to consider, again, how we can celebrate these different forms of capital, and then also how we might help students to develop even more in these various areas. When we talk about first generation transfer students, navigational capital is really significant. And I found from my own experience that this is an area where oftentimes students really could use some bolstering up, some assistance. So historically, this refers to the ability to maneuver through institutions that are created and all of the different aspects of the institution. So thinking through the language and the expectations within our institutions. This is a way for us as administrators, as faculty, as staff, as students ourselves, to think through how we can help foster navigational capital within our transfer students, and specifically for those who are first generation. How can we provide them with the skills and knowledge that they need to successfully navigate through our institutions? Also, I think important in this conversation is the courses themselves. So when we think about first generation transfer students, and I've shared this in other presentations I've made at the NISTS conference in years past, but gateway courses are important to consider. So we know a little bit about, very little, obviously, because we don't have much time in the presentation, but we know a little bit about first generation student identities, and we're beginning to think about the intersections between those identities and transfer student identities. And then we know too now, using Yasso's model, that there are things that we can draw on that can help students to be more successful. And then there are other areas, maybe we need to bolster up students. Gateway courses are significant when we think about, helping our students to navigate and to develop the navigational capital that they need to be successful in our institutions, because these are sometimes barrier courses. So even though transfer students often will come with some course credits, they may still need to take general education courses or courses that we might consider to be gateway courses. Historically, these have been barrier courses, lower division courses, generally within the general education or core curricula. They are often high-risk courses because they yield the highest levels of grades of D's, F's, withdrawals, or incompletes. They also generally have the highest enrollment. And again, high enrollment can be determined based on the institution. But success in these courses is critical for first generation students and for first generation transfer students, because they become vulnerable when they are not successful in these courses, even more vulnerable. So when we think about these courses, they are truly high risk to these students, because if they don't succeed, then the consequences are dire. They are less likely to persist in higher education. And that's important to our first generation transfer students, because we know that they may already feel the push and pull again, from their communities, from their families, from themselves, and they want to be successful. So it's important for us to find ways to create structures and pathways to help them move through these courses and to be ultimately successful in their journey. The last thing I want to mention here before we get into actually looking at some of the pedagogies and practices that respond to what we're learning about our first generation students is this annotated bibliography that you'll see on the screen, also linked in full. It's an open access open education resource publication, and it came out last year from the Center for First Generation Student Success, and I had the good fortune to be one of the authors of it. an annotated bibliography on first generation college students. It covers a gamut of aspects of the first generation college student experience, from identities to co-curricular to the media. And it also touches a lot on pedagogies and practices. And that's a chapter that I had the good fortune to contribute to, and I'll be drawing on some of that and adding to it some additional research that I've done. So this, again, is linked in full in the resources that I've shared with you. And if you're interested, there are also some live briefing recordings and some other recorded presentations about the information in the annotated bibliography that I'm happy to share if you reach out to me. So I would encourage you now to pause this video and to reflect again on a question that I posed at the beginning. What do you know about first generation transfer students at your institution? And from what sources do you gather this information? Now I want to move into the pedagogies and practices. And so this was really motivated by my own experiences, both as first generation identifying individual, but also as someone who has worked with first generation programs and has taught a lot of first generation students over the years, thinking through ways that I could be more inclusive and create more sense of belonging in my face-to-face and online and hybrid courses. So thinking through how I can help students to really make personal meaning of the academic content and self-concepts within the courses that I teach. And so I think that for me also, this was motivated by a desire to make visible the hidden curriculum. So to make visible some of the transparent aspects of higher education that create stumbling blocks for our first generation transfer students and for other identities as well. So first of all, my work is guided by this idea that we need to humanize our pedagogy. This is not good just for first generation transfer students, but for all students and for ourselves, I think, personally. But humanizing pedagogy is strategy that seeks to improve equity gaps. So we have to acknowledge first that the learning environments in which we teach and our students learn are not neutral, that they are filled oftentimes with reinforcements of worldviews that minoritize particular students and particular student identities. And so for me, reflecting on that and looking at my own courses and my own practices, my messaging to students, the readings that I choose, the ways in which I present assignments and activities in my courses has been revolutionized by humanizing and by these elements of humanizing, many of which you'll see in the next set of infographics that I've shared. And these, again, are linked in the resources that I've provided for this session. So humanizing, and this is from Michelle Pacansky-Brock's work, this is focused on online courses, but it translates so well into any mode or modality in which we're teaching, or in various programs as well, not just in academic courses. But there are principles that appear on the left side of the screen: trust, presence, awareness, and empathy. And when we humanize our programs, our services, our courses, we're doing all of these things as educators. We're communicating trust. We're creating some presence. So we have presence, but also our students have presence. So we're not overly present, but there's some intentional presence and authenticity in the presence. There's also awareness. So we know about our students and how we can support them. And then we communicate empathy. And we encourage others to do that within the context of our courses and programs. So what does that look like in my courses? So in all of the courses that I teach, I have statements of inclusion, probably like many of you all do if you're teaching as well. And I think that for me, this is important to acknowledge that this is an area where I'm first trying to communicate belonging. So there are statements of inclusion that come from the institution where I teach. And in addition to that, I have my own statement of inclusion. You can see an example of one of them on the screen and also linked in the resources that I provided. But then I try to go a step further, a few steps further, and have some other humanizing statements that provide, I think, empathy and, again, humanity to the courses I teach. So one example that I provided on the screen is a statement about teaching and learning during a pandemic. So for students that I teach who are first generation and are also transfer students, all of these communicate to them belonging, and I think contribute to what I'm hoping to achieve in the course. And that's to say to them, even in any course I teach, that you are the most important thing. I teach you and I don't teach my subject. So I do want you to leave my class being more knowledgeable about whatever it is that we're learning in this context. But above and beyond all of that, you as a person are most important. You as a learner, you as a human are most important. So it's my job to situate that and to center that in the courses that I teach. So some of the ways that I do that for students, and again, this contributes for first generation students and for first generation transfer students, this contributes to their navigational capital, but it also contributes, I think, to their other forms of capital as well. Linguistic capital is one that I'm really very fond of, thinking about how we can celebrate our own linguistic differences and cultural differences in language. And I do that through using a variety of methods. And what you'll see on the screen now is Universal Design for Learning Guidelines. And in it, there are different forms of representation, engagement, and expression. And I use this when I'm designing my assignments and activities in my courses to provide for multiple means of doing these things. So to allow my students to engage in different ways, because I know for some of them, they may feel more comfortable or confident speaking up in class. Some may feel more comfortable and confident speaking up via discussion board or through a video or through a written expression in a reflective paper. So there are a lot of different ways, and I try to accommodate as many of those as possible. There are also different ways that I can represent the information in my courses. And I think that that's very important. And I invite my students to help me do that. So I have students serving as discussion leaders, and I work with them as a coach to be prepared for that. But we together identify different information, material, resources, and it can be, videos, blogs, all sorts of variety of resources that help to reinforce different ideas or concepts in the courses. And then ultimately, I try to provide variety in the ways in which my students express their learning in the course. So providing them with options for assignments, they may be able to do option A, B, or C. And I find that that's very important, especially for transfer students, because sometimes they may be struggling to find the utility in some of our courses that we're teaching, especially if they're general education courses or even gateway courses. And by allowing them to choose an assignment that speaks to them, or even to propose an assignment variation based on something that's of interest to them and relevant to the content in the course, can be very empowering. It can give them agency and can help them see the utility in what it is that we're asking them to do or to demonstrate as a result of their learning. And there's a lot more about Universal Design for Learning, including some brilliant work by Tisha Fitzgerald that's linked in the resources that I've shared. It's also important, as Pacansky Brock et al. Have said, to get to know about your students, to know more about your students. And what appears on the screen is a screenshot of a piece that I've shared in the Wakelet. I find this to be really useful in all settings, but especially as I'm thinking about and trying to honor the identities of the students in my courses. So trying to honor those first generation transfer students. This is a piece about first day info sheets. And it's a way for us to create inclusive learning environments by knowing more about who our students are and how they identify, what their fears, hopes, aspirations are for our courses. And so this is a take on something I've long done in my courses, but now I do it in a more sophisticated way, and that's to gather information about my students. And again, hopes and fears, and dreams related to their own aspirations into the course. So in this piece, and hopefully you'll have a chance to read and engage with it more, it's linked in full in the Wakelet. There are different variations about the questions that we might ask to get at some of the ways in which our students are going to access information in the course, but they hope to get from the course how they identify challenges that they perceive, opportunities, things that they like or dislike, or that they hope that we do or hope that we don't do. But what I also love about this is that in the body of the article, the authors, Kilpack and Milan, share strategies about how we can use the information that we're learning about our students to make changes in our own programs and practices. So for me, as I'm learning about my students, and I send this out to them about a week before class begins, and I'm learning about them, I'm using that information to embed in my courses resources and information that may have to do with food pantry or financial aid or other sorts of information about the community or tutoring that helps them to be prepared to be successful. Sometimes it's just helping to meet basic needs of my students to assure them that these resources are available and to help them make those connections. So I really love this because of that piece. It just brings it on home in ways that we can really act on in our own courses and again in our own programs and services. If I'm an advisor working with first generation transfer students, I can use the same strategies in my own advising interactions. I also love this particular first generation specific strategy, and I've applied it with transfer students and with other student populations. And it's called critical compassionate pedagogy. And it encourages us as staff, instructors, administrators, whatever our role is, to be critical of institutional and classroom practices that ideologically place underserved students at disadvantaged positions. Again, thinking about the deficit based. So as we refer to students maybe as at risk of whatever, or being less prepared. And then at the same time, it also encourages us to be self-reflexive of our own actions, to hold ourselves accountable, to be compassionate, and to act on our compassion as a daily commitment. And what I love about this is that if we follow this, and it's a fantastic, short, accessible piece about this that I've referenced here, there are 4 foundational components that I can use in my own practice that have to do with observation, feeling, need, and request. And obviously, we don't have time to get into this, but I use these as I'm structuring feedback to my students, as I'm inviting feedback from them as well. I'm observing and I'm recording my observations. I'm recording my feelings. I'm communicating needs. I'm asking my students to communicate their needs. I'm opening channels for requests. So I'm really connected to my own feelings and thoughts and actions, but I'm asking my students to do the same. I'm inviting them then to share that with me and for us to dialogue together about what we can do to, get to wherever it is that we're trying to get. And I think it's a really important and useful way to communicate with students, but ultimately to communicate not just with first generation transfer students, but with any students and with colleagues as well. And one of the other practices that I've referenced, but without using this particular title, is I mentioned earlier, I try to make transparent aspects about expectations and about the hidden curriculum. And I use in particular the TILT approach. This is again hyperlinked in the resource that I've shared with you, but I use the framework that's on the screen, purpose, task, and criteria. I use that with all the assignments and activities in my courses. It's especially important when we think about communicating expectations to students so they understand clearly, first generation transfer students, but also any student population, what the purpose of the assignment or activity is, what are you being asked to do, and then how will you be evaluated? And I use that again for all of my activities and assignments in my courses. The last pedagogy that I want to share with you all, again, is specific to first generation students, but also specific to any students. It falls within the broader realm of metacognitive strategies and techniques, and it's the self-regulated learning cycle. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a quote from a piece, and I obviously don't have time to do this justice either, but to summarize, there's research around first generation STEM students that has shown that students who are trained, who know how to do this, learning how to learn, so who know how to use the self-regulation cycle or metacognitive in their own approaches, do better in their courses significantly based on this research. And there's a lot of other research out there, but I think in particular, when we're thinking about being responsive to first generation transfer students and also empowering them to be successful, not only in our courses, but in other courses, or if we're interacting with them in advising or orientation or in other settings, we can teach them how to do this and therefore empower them to be successful. So the self-regulation learning cycle or self-regulated learning comes from Zimmerman, and there's some links to this also in the resource that I've shared. And basically, it's to be intentional about your approach. So we're asking students before they begin an assignment to do some planning and to set some goals, and also to see the extent to which they understand what they're being asked to do. And if they don't understand, how are they following up and getting additional information that will help them to be successful? And then as they are going through the assignment or activity, they should be monitoring their progress or monitoring their learning as well. So what is it that I understand or don't understand, and where do I need to clarify and get assistance? At that point, as you're identifying those areas where you might need assistance, you're regulating, you're getting help, and you're making adjustments to what you're doing. So instead of repeating the same strategies and approaches that maybe didn't work with your first quiz or test, you're changing your habits. You're getting outside help. You're doing different things to learn and to study and to understand the material. And then at the end, you're reflecting. And sometimes we use things like assignment wrappers or exam wrappers or lecture wrappers to prompt reflection and reaction. But even if we don't, students can still do that sort of reflection and reaction at the end of an assignment or activity. They can do it before it's too late. So they can do it, early on in the semester or by the midpoint of the semester, so then they can make adjustments moving forward. And with that, I want to invite you to think about how you can apply and adapt some of these approaches that I've talked about, and also some of the theoretical and practice examples that I've shared about first generation student identities. How will you use that moving forward? So I invite you to share in the Padlet, and you have a link to this, about some of the takeaways and learnings from this presentation, or if there's still wonderings that you have that you would like to clarify, please share those in this space as well. And again, I invite your questions and thoughts and reactions, and you can reach me using the contact information that's on the slide. And I'm available via email. And if anyone is still on Twitter, I have my Twitter handle there as well. But I would invite you to please stay in touch. I would love to hear your questions and thoughts and reactions, and also to learn more about the ways in which you are fostering sense of belonging or moving even beyond belonging in your own courses or programs aimed at supporting first generation transfer students. Thank you all so much, and I hope that you will stay in touch.